It's not often that a professional athlete's broadcasting career adds to their on-field legacy. Rather, most of the time it is actually quite the opposite. In auto racing, however, a handful of names have gone into the commentary booth post-retirement and created an entirely new legacy for themselves. Darrell Waltrip used his personality to create an entirely new catchphrase that became synonymous only with him. Bobby Unser and Sam Posey made IndyCar broadcasts in the 90s much more entertaining, and generations of F1 fans have come to know Martin Brundle as the gridwalk guy rather than for his accomplishments as a driver, especially in endurance racing. But one man stands above the others as someone who is equally successful as a driver and a commentator. Someone who did more for the growth of NASCAR commentating the races than he did in his driving career. I'm of course talking about Benny Parsons. He, along with Ned Jarrett and Bob Jenkins, formed the first iconic NASCAR broadcasting trio. ESPN played a huge part in the growth of NASCAR nationally in the 1980s and early 1990s, and the trio of Benny, Ned, and Bob was the perfect crew to help a new generation of stock car fans understand what they were witnessing on their TVs every Sunday. Even Cole Trickle raved about them.
Watched on television, of course.
You've seen it on television?
ESPN. The coverage is excellent. You'd be surprised at how much you can pick up.
I'm sure I would.
In fact, several of the iconic lines in Days of Thunder, like hitting the pace car and not being able to pit because the crew was eating ice cream, came from scenarios that actually happened to Benny in real life. Benny was popular as a driver, but his career behind the wheel was so long ago that it has been almost lost to time. Although BP was born in Wilkes County, North Carolina, he didn't start racing until he was a teenager living in Detroit, working at gas stations and as a taxi driver in the big city. Benny plied his trade in the Midwestern ARCA Series, winning 2 championships in 1968 and 1969 before moving back down south and entering the Winston Cup Series. He spent most of the 1970s driving for L.G. DeWitt, a friend and businessman. DeWitt's team was definitely not the biggest or most well-funded, but in tandem with Benny, they were able to capture both a Daytona 500 and a Winston Cup championship by the time the team ran out of funding and had to close up shop by the beginning of the 1980s. In 1973, despite only winning a single race, Parsons won the Winston Cup title. In the season finale at Rockingham, BP was involved in a crash early on, and it seemed all but certain that the points lead he had coming into the race would evaporate by the end of the day, and someone else would take the crown. Instead, many of the mechanics on other teams met Benny behind the wall and helped repair his car enough to get him back out on the track and make up enough positions to narrowly win the championship. It was a show of sportsmanship that only served to highlight what Benny's peers really felt about him. I don't think many of the other big-name drivers back then would have received the same kind of help they had they been in Benny's shoes that day. After running part-time for most of the 1980s, Benny called it a career and headed into the broadcast booth for 1989 and beyond. As commentators, BP and Ned became synonymous with the growth of NASCAR, the same way Howard Cosell and Frank Gifford were synonymous with the growth of Monday Night Football. When ESPN lost the contract to cover NASCAR at the end of 2000, Benny found a new home on NBC and TNT alongside Alan Bestwick and Wally Dallenbach. As NASCAR was exploding in popularity at this point, Benny's notoriety boomed as well. In my opinion, the booth lineup that NBC had with Alan, Wally, and Benny still is better than any booth lineup since and should serve as the standard the network should strive for. Benny was enough of a character to be entertaining but still informative and respectful to the audience, unlike some more recent commentators who insult the audience's intelligence on a weekly basis. I don't care what people say, the commentary lineup is important. A lot of people have been complaining about Fox and NBC for many years now in the current time, and certain commentators are a big part of that complaining. Fox doesn't even have a permanent third commentator. It's hard to build chemistry with Mike and Clint if someone new is in there every week. Benny, Wally, and Alan had great chemistry. In the moment, as a kid, I preferred Fox's coverage over NBC, but when I see clips of races from the early 2000s, it really sticks out how great NBC's coverage was from 2001 to 2004, and Benny contributed to that success in spades. Watching Benny in the booth or during his pre-race segments, you could really tell he had a real passion for the sport of stock car racing, and it showed in his work. I think there's something to be said about a guy who really wanted to be there because he wanted to share his passion with millions watching at home, versus a guy who goes into the booth because the network is willing to pay him an enormous sum to do so. I'm absolutely a nostalgia-driven person. Watching NBC or TNT every Sunday in the summer and fall, seeing the season-long championship race develop over months, was a big part of my childhood. If I had my way, I'd take NASCAR back to where it was in 2002 and say, no, it's perfect. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Hearing Fuel by Metallica as NBC's intro song and listening to Alan, Wally, and especially Benny as a 6-year-old was incredible. I'm sure everyone has those childhood memories that just hit different. I think the eventual loss of Benny Parsons in 2007 really hurt for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, losing such a beloved person is always hard, but as someone who wasn't old enough to see him race and didn't know him personally, I can only speak to the impact he had on me as a commentator in the booth. I know that the racing community loved BP, so I'm sure he was every bit the man he seemed like on TV. In my opinion, most of the guys that started being commentators in recent years never had the same charm, but I guess that's what made Benny unique. Some athletes aren't cut out for broadcasting as color commentators after they retire, and that's okay. BP was down to earth, a real gentleman, and could elicit laughter and show he was having a good time while still treating the races with importance and gravitas. I truly believe he was the greatest commentator NASCAR has ever had, and I don't believe he can ever be surpassed. They really don't make him like Benny anymore.